Hi, welcome everyone. And this is our latest interview on the Smart Future Forum of the Center for a Smart Future. Both throughout the COVID-19 pandemic and now with the severe economic crisis, one of the sectors that has probably got a little less attention than it should has been education. Of course, in the news, we from time to time hear about the strains placed on the education sector and children in school and university. We hear about shortages of paper for exams to be printed. We hear about teachers and students now unable to get to school because of fuel shortages. And of course, all of this comes on the back of the strains on the education sector induced by the COVID-19 pandemic, with extended curfews and lockdowns and this learning from home, virtual learning kind of experiment. Now, we thought that it would be a good idea to speak to someone who has given leadership to education sector reform in Sri Lanka and continue to stay engaged in the education sector for many years, and now also playing a role regionally and internationally. And that is none other than Dr. Tara de Mel. And before I introduce her and kick our roundtable discussion off, I want to also welcome my colleagues, Anisha Gunaratne and Nimaya Dahanayake, who are researchers at CSF. Dr. Tara de Mel is no stranger to most of us. She's a renowned educationist who has served the government of Sri Lanka for nearly 2 decades, including as once the secretary to the Ministry of Education and vice chairperson of the National Education Commission. And throughout her career, she has been a strong advocate of quality and equity of education and has been actively involved in improving the sector. She currently serves as a co-chair of Education Forum Sri Lanka and is a member of the Worldwide Commission to Educate All Kids, as well as recently also joining the UNESCO Advisory Board of the Global Education Monitoring Report. So welcome, Dr. de Mel, and thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure.
I think Nimaya will kick us off, and then we'll just take the conversation from there. Nimaya, over to you.
Thank you, Anushka. Dr. de Mel, to start things off, I think you will agree with me when I say that Sri Lanka's education sector is in crisis. With the onset of the pandemic a few years ago and now the economic crisis, the education sector has undoubtedly seen a lot of challenges. So in light of these challenges, could you maybe start us off by explaining what you think are the critical features of the current crisis in education?
Yes. So before I get to the current crisis in education, let's rewind a bit, and not just to 2020 when the pandemic hit in March 2020 to be exact. If you rewind even a little bit more, you would all agree, I'm sure, that Sri Lankan education system was not really a flagship or to be boasted about in Asia or the rest of the world. We were far behind. We were far behind on many indices, although we had good literacy rates, good numeracy rates in South Asia, and lots of people used to commend us on that. We never really took the plunge and went into the actual indices that we should have been proud about, like digital literacy, for example. Our digital learning was far behind. So it's in that kind of backdrop that we entered the pandemic crisis. And the pandemic hit us really bad, just like it hit 180 odd countries. Nearly 1.8 billion children around the world got shuttered out of schools during the pandemic. We know that. But what happened in Sri Lanka was unique in that during the 20 or 21 months that Sri Lankan students lost their school education, unlike most of the countries, particularly in the global north, which compensated with internet-based education with sufficient devices and internet penetration, which was very good in most countries in the north, global north, I mean, Sri Lanka suffered immensely because our internet access was way below 40 or 35%. And I'm quoting the Department of Census Statistics of 2019. Our device penetration was also very dismal. It was something like less than 30 or 35%. Computers and laptops are very sparse among school-age children. But when the pandemic got going, by 2021, there are studies done by Learn Asia. You'll find that the use of smartphones increased. There was a little more enthusiasm for data packages, and somehow parents began to get some kind of internet access to kids. So a certain amount of internet-based education, not really online learning, which has been used very fashionably, but that happened to really a very small percentage of kids only. So by 2021, a certain amount of internet-based education reached the majority of children. Still for all, remote learning in most places was very poor. Television was used, experimented with by the government to deliver education, and that didn't work out well. Many reasons for that I can explain if we have time. Similarly for radio-based learning. So all in all, by the end of 2021, when schools began to open, Sri Lanka was in a pretty bad place in terms of loss of education. Also, we must know Sri Lanka was one of the last 5 schools in the world to reopen after the pandemic. We reopened very late. The teacher vaccinations were very late. Student vaccinations were late. So all in all, we were really not very well off at all. So in 2021, November, schools began to open, but there was no assessment of what kind of learning losses children had. When children stay out of school for months on end, there is a chunk of learning they have lost. There have been studies published starting from the end of 2020, starting with 5 African countries, for example, like Ethiopia and Uganda and so on, where they have calculated the learning losses. Subsequently, of course, countries in Northern Europe, then Brazil, in Chile, in South Africa, and our very own neighbor India in the state of Karnataka. They published studies where they calculated learning losses. Why do we need to know the learning losses? Because we can't fly blind. We must know to what extent our kids have lost their education in reading, in math, arithmetic, in comprehension, simple learning outcomes. And it's only when we know the harsh truth that we can train our teachers, equip our teachers to bring the kids up to speed. That could have been done easily, but sadly, that did not happen. To date, I don't think we know the exact amount of learning that was lost during that 21-month period, which is, I mean, it's a very poor show, if I may say so. So it's in this backdrop that January 2022 came, and then it was a double whammy on our students, or maybe a triple whammy. When the economic crisis hit, kids were just barely picking up their pieces and trying to get to school. Still, school textbooks were not distributed on time. I don't think even to date, most students have got their textbooks. Uniforms were very late in being delivered. Still, some schools, even national schools in Colombo district, some of them, teachers give tokens to the parents to go and buy uniforms from a nearby shop. And you can imagine what that would be in the economic crisis we are going through. Then came the transport crisis, which is so acute now, that is hampering lots and lots of children from attending school. Yesterday, in fact, I had a discussion with some zonal education directors, and they said nearly 60% of students don't come to the school due to transport crisis, because in the urban and the semi-urban sector, that's so important. Villages, yes. Rural schools, not much of an issue because kids walk to school. So that's a reality. And then to me, the most critical is the lack of nutrition. I think you all know how important nutrition is for the brain growth of young children. and it's only with nutrition, an adequate meal before they leave home, and also an adequate midday meal when they come to school that helps them to understand what's being taught, absorb what's being taught, and have proper learning. So the meal they had before they came to school, that too is deprived in most cases. The midday meal that the government was providing in a substantial number of schools has been stopped. So it's really sad to see that when teachers speak of students coming into school and they ask the kids to open the lunch boxes during the tea break, they open the lunch boxes, there's nothing in it. So the canteens don't have food. So the teachers were saying how, I mean, it's more a mental trauma for them to see kids without food. So that's another reason why the dropout rate is increasing, attendance is falling, and obviously learning is taking a severe beating. So we in Sri Lanka today, in the education sector, we are in a pretty dismal state, if you ask me. O-levels have just started. Kids are getting to the exam halls with so much of difficulty. I think everybody knows the problems they are going through. But still for all, even if they manage to sit the papers and get some marks, we really don't know how their mental state is. Emotionally, children have been battered. The 20 months where lockdowns was the norm created a serious emotional upheaval. Social emotional learning has to be done for them to pick up from there. So the problems are huge. There are so many things that are happening right now. My main concern is whether the gravity of all this is being understood by the people who should actually understand it. The education crisis is one out of several crises, I know that. But whether the people concerned know how relevant this crisis is in the long term, and for the long-term impact of any economic recovery, if we hope to have in the future. So that is the biggest problem that occupies my mind right now on this topic.
Thank you, Dr. Nimel. I think you outlined very broadly and succinctly, in a sense, the extent of this crisis. And you talked about, perhaps there is a lack of recognition of the magnitude of this. And I want to ask you about one part of that, which is the lasting impacts, given the magnitude, the likely lasting impacts of this crisis in education for the country's future, particularly the productivity of our workforce. Because there's in economics, there's this concept of scarring, and with multiple years of education being impacted and learning losses, and now everything you outlined with the current crisis, that scarring that's going to affect a generation of young people may not be known for years. It may not immediately be obvious. So what are your thoughts around these lasting impacts on the economy and the productivity of our workforce?
So first of all, we spoke of learning losses, which have not been quantified or scientifically assessed. So we have a child who is in grade 3, who goes into school in November 2021. He goes into grade 4 without having that education he should have had during grade 3. So that is the chunk of education he has lost. So if you extrapolate that, you find that kids going into OL and AL, but without huge their time spans, big chunks of education lost. So when they leave school, they are going to leave school with handicaps in learning. So there will be situations where, apart from the dropouts, I'm not talking of the dropouts now, who drop out before the end of school, but you will have people who are undereducated, children who are undereducated or uneducated, who are entering a socio-economic milieu as of today, which is anyway harsh. Economically, it's harsh, it's socially harsh, it's mentally, it's emotionally very draining. So we have children who are already unprimed educationally or emotionally, entering a social milieu which is not favorable to them at all. That's the first point. The second point is the type of skills that they have when they leave school. Of course, Sri Lanka is a country where the majority of students never had those high-end type of digital tech skills, which help them to get good high-paying jobs. We never had that. A large number of students never had that. But now it's even worse because we are going to have a group of children who come out into society who are underskilled, who are under-equipped. So what kind of jobs can they get? So the people who are going to stay in this country, I'm going to talk about the migratory population in a bit. But the kids who decide to stay back will only be able to enter very low-skilled employment. So what kind of contribution can they make towards the economic growth or to our per capita income? How can they expand the human capital in that sense? They can't. So therefore, the ideal types of jobs that should have had highly skilled young people entering is not going to happen. So therefore, we will be depleted in the tech industry, in the digital industry, in the IT industry, in the industries that are going to generate economically favorable disciplines will not be filled. So then we have the other group of people who will somehow find ways and means of migrating. I think you all know about this very well, how large numbers of students, particularly those who have a good level of intellect, who have a certain amount of skill sets, who have the ability to converse in English, they will somehow go overseas. And most of such people are, I think, have gone or they are in the process of leaving. So all in all, we have this big brain drain, or those who remain are not going to contribute to the economy significantly. Marginally, yes. Then we have this massive divide. Sri Lanka anyway had a big socioeconomic divide, as you know, and people talk of how well the pandemic exposed the digital divide. I think you'd agree with me, yes. Of course, it's ironical because Sri Lanka is still talking about the exposure of the digital divide, whereas countries in the global north and those in the developed world are talking about the AI divide, the divide in artificial intelligence and the related skills. Okay, now still for all, we had a big digital divide. The COVID pandemic exposed that. Currently, the social divide, the socio-economic divide is massive, and it is increasing day by day. Why? Because those who are at the bottom of the ladder in terms of education, skills, and training have no way of coming up for the reasons we mentioned. Last of all, but I think the most important of all, when you asked about long-term impact, is the emotional resilience, the resilience of young people to deal with this crisis. If it finishes in 1 year or 2 years or 3 years, unless they are emotionally prepared, unless they have the resilience to cope with this debacle, this period where we are going through this calamity, it will be very difficult for them to fit into society as adults who are mature, who are able to contribute towards the economic growth of this country. So all in all, I think we are, again, very negative statement I'm making, but that's the reality. The present situation is bad. Long-lasting impact is definitely going to be bad, unless certain out-of-the-box thinking, some kind of creative, innovative interventions are made in some way or the other to save the current nosedive in education and training that we are going through.
Dr. De Mel, I think the issues in respect of the education crisis, I think you highlighted them very well, and especially how the current education crisis is also affecting different students that come from different socioeconomic backgrounds differently as well. So in light of these challenges, what kind of policies or strategies should the government adopt to ensure that no one gets left behind?
I would look at this from two ends of the spectrum. One would be immediate. When I say immediate now, I mean, that's what I mean by now. Immediate interventions have to be made to get the children back to school. That has to be done. Well, what I'm going to say now would seem simple, would seem very mundane, but it's not being done. For example, if children are somehow facilitated to get to school through transport interventions. For example, if school vans are given some form of fuel prioritization. I mean, there aren't millions of school vans, there'll be thousands of school vans. So that's one. I think if discussions are immediately held between the authorities that are responsible for the fuel distribution and those that are responsible for the transport sector, buses, vans, and immediately some kind of thing, some mechanism so that the school vans are functional. I think that's the first thing. Of course, preceding that, one must quickly do an audit to find out how many school vans are there. We have just 9 provinces in this country. We have just 4.3 million school children. It's not a massive number. It can be done. And the teachers have to be motivated, encouraged, incentivized to get to school. Because the same problems are faced by the teachers. They too have to get to school. And unless they are motivated, unless they are encouraged, what kind of education will they give in class? So that to me is the first step. You have to immediately, again, simultaneously, these are not sequential initiatives I'm recommending, immediately in parallel, make sure that the uniforms and the books are given to these kids. We have 9 provincial education directors. We have 99 education zones. Education is a very well devolved subject. Those institutions in the periphery, in the provinces are working very well. Like I mentioned, I was having this discussion with some zonal directors yesterday, and how they identified these problems, how they said things can be done if they are given the authority and some kind of help. I'm talking of financial help. So getting the kids back to school, nutrition is a must. Some kind of school meal has to be given. I was told yesterday that the World Bank has formally agreed to give funds to restart the school meals program. I was also told from reliable sources that the World Food Program has promised the same. Now, those promises have to get translated into action. Giving the money is one thing, but getting the meal in the school is another thing. So I'm going to take this opportunity just to share with you a small initiative that we started a few weeks ago. I don't think the authorities realize the amount of goodwill that is also there in the country. The kinds of well-wishers, the people who are wanting to support. So I was put in touch with a group like that, community-based organizations, and they were willing to be the conduit for donors, well-wishers, supporters, to channel money to individual schools or to the education divisions or the zones, so that the principals could be able to buy the provisions and get the parents to cook a small meal every day on site. So to cut a long story short, this is nothing new. We had done this 20 years ago. It's possible, but at that time there was no economic crisis. So within 2 weeks, we have been able to enlist 13 schools from very impoverished areas in the country, like Haliella Division in Badulla, Maha Oya in Ampare, the Jaffna Education Zone within the Jaffna district, just to give you some examples. So the program is being rolled out next week. The donor gives the money through this channel that I mentioned to the individual principals. The principals maintain accounts and get the parents to cook the meal. So what I'm trying to say is these are not like mega ideas that come from nowhere, simple initiatives, but can be done. And the Ministry of Health, I was told yesterday again, how they had done a similar thing, and the coordination of that particular initiative, that's for hospitals, distribution of pharmaceuticals and medical consumables. The coordination happens in the Ministry of Health. So my question is, why can't this kind of coordination happen in the Ministry of Education? Because then people know there's a credible source through which funding can be distributed. So what I'm saying is we have to do something now, not tomorrow, to get the transportation thing going, getting kids back to school, uniforms, textbooks, and definitely a school meal, and to entice and encourage teachers to come back to the classroom invigorated to teach. So that's the immediate, the now. Long term. Now, like I mentioned, we are coming out of a pandemic, going through an economic crisis. Education losses are massive. So if we are able to measure those education losses in parallel to what I'm going to say now, that is the ideal, because then you get to know the harsh truth about where the kids are. Because for one thing is you can't have ambitious curricula or introduce curricular reforms and new initiatives into a group of children who are already suffering a learning loss. It's absurd, because I don't think any country in the world introduced ambitious curricula into a situation like this. So if we are able to assess the kinds of learning losses we have, at least in the coming few months, at least from 2023 January, if technology-based education can be brought in with assistance from development partners, and development partners are very willing to assist us. I'm not just talking about the major development partners like the World Banks and the ADB and the UN-related agencies. There are lots of others as well. If we can bring technology into the fore and invest smartly into education, invest smartly into digital learning, and use technology as a pivotal way to expand the education access to children, which is what countries like Cambodia did from Asia, Vietnam did, Rwanda did, Serbia did. So many countries have done that in the last 1 year. So we need to think out of the box, get as much help as possible around the table, and bringing new innovations to make sure that the education that the kids have lost, we have to catch up and more, but that can't happen immediately, maybe in 4, 5, or 6 months from now. So those are the main things that I'm seeing as a future. Another thing that I must mention is that remedial instruction is something that most countries did when they emerged from the pandemic. Remedial meaning it was like a targeted instruction. For that, you need to know where your learning losses are. And based on the learning losses, very pinpoint, I mean, with surgical precision, they gave the type of targeted education which was necessary as a grade relevant and an age appropriate manner. So those are some of the ideas for a long term coming out of this crisis, as I see it.
Thank you, Dr. De Mel. I think you touched on something which is very important and isn't really widely discussed, the fact that schools provide more than just education. It's a hub for nutrition, for health, for sanitation, for water. In light of everything that's going on in the country at this moment, and keeping in mind that maybe even things like school vans and school buses might take a bit of time to materialize if it's about getting children into school, what strategies can people do or the government really deploy to make sure that children are getting access to these essential services without having to go to school?
Without having to go to school, that's the challenge. I personally am not in favor of promoting a strategy without having to go to school, because we've seen the problems, the consequences of a 20-month absence of school. Not just the lack of education, the emotional crises that children went through, I'm sure you have heard about. The types of even some children went into depression because homes are not really conducive spaces for education. So even during the lockdown period, there are studies now emerging about what children went through when having to stay at home. That's first thing. And of course, I have not mentioned the types of abuses that spiked during that period. Violence, domestic abuse, sexual abuse, and so on. Now, having said that, if we have to go back to remote learning once again, I really wish it never happens. But if that does happen, we have to increase the access to digital learning. We have to increase the access to internet-based education. So that means devices once again, and you all know what a problem it is to get a good quality device. I mean, a tab and a laptop, that would be ideal, but most kids during the pandemic use smartphones, and that was accompanied by so many health issues connected to the eyes, then the dopamine issues, the addictions. I mean, you know, the list of things. So supposing we have to go back to that, certain important interventions have to be made now. One thing is, whoever is giving these data packages, we have to talk to the industry, the people who usually give these data packages at a cost, to give them at a nominal cost. Again, the same thing for devices, and to simultaneously train the teachers. The pedagogy has to be instilled into them on how a digital learning, how internet-based education can be imparted, because it's totally different from the curriculum that is delivered in the classroom. But I'm still looking at that as the second or the last option, because still I'm very hopeful that schools can do what they are supposed to do. In the case of sanitation, I mean, even recently, a minister from the government said more than 500 schools don't have water on tap. Even the schools which have water through tube wells find it very difficult to access water for various purposes, particularly those connected to sanitation. So these are things that development partners and related agencies that have been working closely with the government of Sri Lanka for years can help. I am very confident that if the correct buttons are pressed, the corporate sector, the industry, well-wishers, the NGO, community-based organizations will help in trying to get the kids back to school. Failing which, well, I'm going back to what you said now. In that case, we have to go back to what it was in 2020 and early 2021, which is home-based learning with the kinds of provisos that I mentioned, which is suboptimal in every sense. And that is not something I think we should advocate or move towards.
Definitely agree, Dr. Dimel. And you spoke of interventions, and I know you do a lot of work regionally and internationally with different types of platforms. What, in your opinion, are some of the interesting innovations you've seen being adopted in comparable countries that could potentially be useful for Sri Lanka?
Yes, thank you for that question, because from early 2020, when the pandemic was raging, comparable countries, like you mentioned, economically comparable countries from the East and the West, they took measures that we didn't take, unfortunately. They took several steps to bring in internet access to kids in the remote areas of their countries with the help of UN agencies and others. Let me quickly talk about Rwanda and Vietnam. Rwanda is a real case in point, because like in Sri Lanka, the rural parts of Rwanda had hardly any internet penetration. Device access was poor, very similar. And mind you, you know with what history Rwanda came from. So it was a country that had suffered so much. But nevertheless, very swiftly, they came into an arrangement with UN agencies and ITU, that's International Telecommunications Union, which is part of the UN network. And using satellites, various types of devices, they managed to expand their internet accessibility to the rural parts of Rwanda. So much so that their internet-based education, their online, actual online, face-to-face education happened much better than it happened in Sri Lanka. Similarly, with Vietnam, they had a particular project called the GIGA project, which is still ongoing. It needed to map out initially what are the parts of the country that didn't have proper internet access, medium term, long term, and so on. So they did all of that very swiftly, and those are documented in the literature, particularly Rwanda, Vietnam, and then Cambodia did a lot. Like I mentioned earlier, Serbia did a lot of countries in Latin America, and some countries in Asia. So one thing they did was to make sure that the internet penetration increased, make sure the device accessibility increased, and make sure that their pedagogy was tuned in accordance to a delivery which was online. More importantly, they diagnosed their education learning losses very early in the day. I mentioned some of it. So they knew what they were dealing with. So they were able to train their teachers, and they trained their teachers online. I mean, because everybody was doing things online. So training teachers was done very swiftly. So within months, teachers were able to impart the same curriculum, but through a different methodology to students. So that's what happened during the last 24 months. Now people are moving ahead fast and furious. Now the trends are to introduce the newer technologies. Like I mentioned, AI is a big component in curricula. The UNESCO is leading an effort. There are at least 15 countries that have already introduced AI into their curricula with ethics and on an ethical background, starting with the primary. So tech-based education, and the investment is largely on STEM education, science, technology, engineering, and maths. And that is happening across the board, not just in countries like Singapore or Finland or the UK, but it's happening across lots and lots of countries. I mean, just take India, for example. Of course, when India entered the pandemic, their digital revolution was already going on. Although they have large pockets of poverty, they also have large pockets of students, school students and university students that have a lot of access to internet and internet-based education. So when during the pandemic, when these innovations were being discussed and rolled out, the 1 out of the 4 startups that were established were in financial technology. And the unicorns, a unicorn is an organization which it's worth $1 billion US. The numbers of unicorns expanded. Now, this is India, our neighbor, whose average literacy and numeracy is still behind Sri Lanka. But see how well they invested in STEM. Their IITs and IIMs, they raced ahead using technology and digital innovations. So that's where the world is heading. The 4th industrial revolution is now being actually relegated to a degree by the 5th industrial revolution. That's what they're talking about. Primary school kids are having the elements of design learning, robotics, automation in their little curriculum. So where are we? So that is what's inspiring when you work with people outside Sri Lanka, when you listen to what they're doing. That's what we should do, actually. Listen to what others are doing, watch what others are doing. And all those countries are also not very, very wealthy countries falling into the high income bracket. But they realize the importance. They understand why those interventions are essential, because a child who is going to primary school today, when he leaves school in 10 or 15 years, the types of jobs that he will be being interviewed for are not in existence today, as you know. The Oxford University published a study recently where they said by 2030 is just 8 years from now, 30% of the jobs that will be available and in vogue in 2030 are not even seen today in our job markets. So that is my worry, my concern, that the authorities in Sri Lanka don't understand that we are deep in a well. We were always in a well, but now we are in the bottom of the well. And to come out of that well and to see what's going on in the rest of the world is going to take us a while. And if we don't do that, we will remain at the bottom of this well or even sink further. So I know these are very unhappy sentiments I'm expressing, but that's the reality. And unless we do something really fast and do it now, I think the situation will not look up for us anytime soon.
Dr. Dimel, on that point about our policymakers and decision makers needing to realize and take action, I'm almost trying to draw a parallel with this crisis and the core macroeconomic crisis, where it took it to come to this level of intensity and despair for people to realize how bad economic decision making had been, or flawed economic policies and policy missteps. And it's almost, there could be a sense of optimism that, okay, so then there is a realization of what not to do, and there is a hope that moving from here, we would take better decisions. So my question to you is, on the education sector side, are you hopeful about any areas in education policy and education sector reform that could get done moving forward from here, that couldn't get done before, but now there is a realization of the problem, the acute nature of the problem. So reality has struck, and that could force us to actually do things that we haven't done before. Are there any parts of the current crisis that make you optimistic about the future, or any bright spots?
Yeah, so first of all, the economic crisis, as we are facing it now, is what has made us open our eyes and understand like the gravity of it and the bad decisions that led to it. But in the case of education, there are two things that I want to highlight. One is, I really don't think there is a realization or an understanding that we are at the bottom of the well. I really don't think that has happened. And I really don't think it will happen soon either. Because as long as you hold, I'm talking from the perspective of the decision makers, as long as you hold the O-levels on time, as long as you hold the A-levels on time, as long as you hold the grade 5 scholarship exam and publish the cutoff marks, you're happy. But that is not education. That is the most fundamental thing that I'm trying to say. What is happening to our school leavers? Look at the universities today. We have 17 state universities, and we have some 70 higher educational institutions. Some are degree awarding, some are not. When 250,000 kids sit the A-level and just about 200, or maybe less, about 160,000 qualify for university admission, still just about 25,000 or maybe 30,000 students enter the state universities. The rest of them want to get into a private higher education provider. So why is that? Because our 17 universities are not delivering what they should. They are not up to the level which other universities are globally. So my point is that there is no realization that we have a huge mile to run to emerge from the education crisis that, as I mentioned at the beginning, we were in pre-COVID, exacerbated with COVID, and now really shot off the mark post-COVID due to the current economic crisis. So I am very, very concerned because that realization hasn't happened. It is only when that realization happens and we remove the blinkers and you open our eyes to what's happening around us, it's only then that the understanding will come. We are not okay. Right. It's as simple as that. The current economic crisis, like I mentioned, will wind up in 8 years. That's how they say it, isn't it? 5 or 8 years or something like that. But can we wait for 5 or 8 years for the education crisis to resolve? No, because a child has lost the most important part of his life by then. The most formative years where the brain growth is maximum, where the absorption and understanding capacity is maximum. We have finished that part. You can't go back to a child when he was 10 years, once he's 18. So I don't think you can draw a parallel with the economic crisis. But without solving the economic crisis, you can never expect to get out of the crisis. Without resolving the education crisis, you will never have a sustainable economic recovery. Human capital development will not happen unless there's economic recovery. And economic recovery is fundamental for all these to happen, obviously. But without human capital development, economic recovery will never be sustainable. So
I think that's absolutely essential message, I think, for all of us and policymakers and others to hear, and frankly, the private sector as well. Before we close, Dr. Dimel, I'm going to give an opportunity to my colleagues, Nimaya or Anisha, if they have any other follow-up questions they'd like to ask.
Just one question from my end, Dr. Dimel, and kind of more in the spirit of learning from failure when it comes to implementing these policies going forward. You spoke about how the government implemented TV learning as well as radio learning, and it didn't work. Could you just expand on that a bit, and what learnings we can take forward from that into future policies we would potentially make?
Yes. So let's take television-based learning. So, you know, on average, Sri Lankan family, most families have a television. The upper middle class and the upper classes would have maybe more than 2 televisions in the house. So if you look at the bulk of the population with 1 television set, what the government did was they tried to develop a timetable for the different grades or groups of grades, and to deliver a one-way, it's not two-way, television is obviously one-way, lessons. Now, when you have a family with 2 or 3 children in different grades, timetables are clashing, parents need the television for their entertainment, how does it work? It didn't. So when they launched this, we from Education Forum Sri Lanka said this is not going to work for the following reasons, and predictably didn't. So subsequently, Education Forum Sri Lanka did a survey, a telephone survey of teachers, and they said exactly what we said, that it was difficult. Also, it's just a one-way relay of information, and that's not education. There's no opportunity for the child to ask a question. So it's just a didactic, you know, reading out a text or a lesson. So that's why television learning is certainly not a remote learning method that is recommendable. Ditto for radio learning. I mean, like a transistor radio where a lesson is being delivered. Again, if there are 2 children in the family, how does that work? You can't. It has to be sequenced properly, and if it suits one family, it won't suit the other. So that is why out of the methods existing for remote learning, the one that became most successful was online learning or internet-based sharing of information through WhatsApp, or in the best circumstances, face-to-face teaching. But then again, that was suboptimal, like I said. I mean, it's certainly no replacement for classroom-based face-to-face teaching, and that is now recorded globally. Countries that have had successful online learning have said there is no substitute to the classroom learning at any cost.
Dr. Dimel, I have a question as well. So this is in respect of what you said in terms of the possible solutions to the education crisis that we are facing. And I think a common thread running through all of those solutions was that it has to be student-centric. And when it comes to, for instance, the example you gave about learning losses, how that has not been, we were not able to quantify or measure the learning losses that students had to go through. What sort of evidence and research-based gaps that researchers in the education field must focus on or must give more priority to in the current context?
Yes, so in fact, I had a couple of discussions. We have this organization called NEREC, whose mandate is primarily to do research on education. I wrote to NEREC and also to Sri Lanka Association for Advanced Education Development, SLAD, that's the acronym. I know the people there. I spoke to them and said, look, can you all start some studies to assess learning losses through simple diagnostic tests? And, you know, most countries like in Brazil and South Africa, they did telephone surveys and asked teachers, how did the teachers perceive the learning losses? So it was not a complicated diagnostic test. It was a simple diagnostic test because people couldn't go out of their homes, even in those countries, so they used the telephone. So sadly, there was no positive response to that. To date, I have not seen anything published on a diagnostic test. When you say diagnostic test, like I mentioned, apart from a telephone survey, it could be like a simple formative assessment. When a child comes into class, you give a simple test, like a class-based assessment in a very simple way, just to assess what the reading or the math or the comprehension is like in comparison to what it used to be, say, 6 months ago or 1 year ago. Now, if the results of such a study is available, then there is evidence for teachers to know how to deal with those kids in the next term or in this current term. Now, that is the information we don't have. So I think that is something I wish even non-government sector research organizations can take up and speak to 100 teachers, maybe across the 9 provinces, and see whether there is a method of assessing it. I would strongly encourage and advise anybody who has the ability to do that. Once we know that, then at least we know the devil we are facing. At the moment, we don't know. We're just flying blind, as I said before.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dimel. That has been a very comprehensive overview of some of the challenges we're facing right now. I think some of the big takeaways for me was, one, that the current crisis in education comes not only on the back of the challenges induced by the COVID-19 pandemic, but also, you know, the legacy issues we've been facing in education. The second aspect was, you know, whether it was the pandemic or now with the economic crisis, the need to get some quick sense of the learning losses, the impacts on students' education, because without knowing that, how can you calibrate for the future, right, and take the right steps? We also talked very briefly, not briefly, I think we talked also about the nutrition aspects of schooling. And I think the final takeaway for me was really recognizing the magnitude of this challenge. Otherwise, we're not going to take the steps. And I'm struck by the fact that you didn't see a parallel. And, you know, as you said it, I realized there isn't a parallel between the realization on the economic crisis and the realization on the education crisis, because at least on the economic crisis, there is now a recognition that we have hit rock bottom. Whereas, as you noted, in education, there still isn't that. And that's probably the most troubling. So thank you very much for taking the time to be with us on this very wide-ranging interview. And we hope we can stay engaged with you as our work progresses and your work progresses. I also want to encourage our audience to check out a brief article that, you know, touches on some of these.